Hello, 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 hello. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, hello. Hello, Isaac here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Or if you're new, welcome. Now, for those that don't know, I make videos like this on history, culture, and theology, as well as some travel videos too. This year, I'm really trying to put out more content on YouTube, so please do subscribe to get updates on the new videos. And if you like the videos like this, please do give it a like so that I can keep making them. So I previously did a series of videos on the Jewish author Philo of Alexandria and the Alexandrian riots of 38. Do give it a watch if you haven't. But continuing on that theme, I thought it would be interesting to do a new series on Flavius Josephus, another Jewish author from the 1st century who was actually born in 37 AD, so around the time of the riots. Briefly, for those that don't know, Flavius Josephus, born Josephus, son of Mattathyahu, was a priestly aristocrat in Judea, and during the early stages of the Jewish-Roman War, he was leading part of the defense in Galilee. But after the territory got overrun in the spring of 67 AD, he surrendered to the Romans. In fact, the story goes that he and his 40 soldiers were trapped in a cave because of the Roman army, and they chose suicide over capture, settling on a method of committing suicide by drawing lots. But Josephus and another man remained until the end, and instead of killing themselves, they decided to surrender to the Romans. In response, Vespasian kept Josephus as a slave and presumably an interpreter during the war. And then, after the Jewish war, he was taken to Rome, gained his freedom, and spent the rest of his life writing about the war itself, Judean history and culture, as well as his own career. He would compose 4 invaluable works, and in this series, we'll look at one of his lesser known works, Against Apion. In Against Apion, Josephus sought to respond to Jewish critics and defend Jewish history, beliefs, and practice. But there is also an interesting connection to Philo and the Alexandrian riots, because Apion, one of the Jewish critics Josephus responds to, was part of the Alexandrian embassy to Gaius, on the opposing side to Philo and his Judean counterparts. Indeed, it appears that Apion wrote several works, none of which have survived, but at least one of those works was directed against the Jews, and Josephus will respond to that in Book 2 of his Against Apion. So, in the next few episodes, I'll be going through this book, summarizing its arguments and making my own observations along the way. And for those that are interested, I'll be using John Barclay's translation and commentary. John Barclay himself stressed the huge literary and historical value of this book, not only because it was the only representative of ancient Jewish literature that can be regarded as an apologetic, but because of the huge range of sources that Josephus cites and interacts with, many of whom not survived beyond antiquity. As he writes, "In this work, we encounter Josephus at his rhetorical best. He displays an impressive cultural range and knowledge of Greek history, historiography, and philosophy, and his interlocking arguments in defense of Judeans are spiced with acute literary analysis and clever polemics. From Apion, we also learn precious information about the reputation of Judeans in antiquity through the critics and commentators cited by Josephus, many otherwise obscure. Therefore, let's turn now to this precious gem, Against Apion, and its aims and purposes." And so Josephus signals the topics covered in his work in his introduction. Here he refers to his previous book he wrote, Jewish Antiquities, which contained the 5,000-year history of the Jewish people, which he tells us was taken from the sacred books and translated into the Greek tongue. This work was probably published around 93 AD, but it seems that Josephus had his detractors in the Greco-Roman world, and so the purpose of this more recent work is to address those critics. As Josephus writes, However, since I see that considerable number of people pay attention to the slanders spread by some out of malice, and disbelieve what I have written on ancient history, but adduce as proof that our people is of more recent origin, that it was not thought worthy of any mention by the most renowned Greek historians, I thought it necessary to write briefly on all these matters. First, he seeks to explain the comparative silence of Greek authors, while citing evidence of Judean antiquity from Oriental authorities that do mention the Jews, such as Mattathyahu the Egyptian, Tyrian records and historians who cite them, Dias and Menander, and Berosus the Babylonian. But besides this, he will show from the Greek writers that they do in fact speak of the Jews and prove their antiquity, and he will quote from authors such as Hermippus's biography of Pythagoras, Theophrastus, Herodotus, Cioelius, Aristotle, Hecataeus of Abdera, and Agatharchides. Secondly, he provides a refutation of the slander directed against the Jewish people and their history, and so his work will contain a detailed refutation in turn of Manetho, Chaeremon, Lysimachus, and Apion. The treatment of Apion, though, will take up most of his second book, for out of all the slanders addressed, Apion probably left the most insidious legacy in Rome through his portrayal of the cultural and political deficiencies of the Jewish people. But after his introduction, and before he addresses these two main topics we have outlined, he will set out to attack the framework of Greek historiography and show the superiority of non-Greek Judean historiography. And so, in relation to Greek historiography, he alludes to the fact that people think that one should only pay attention to the Greeks in relation to great antiquity, which he finds quite astonishing since, as he writes, everything to do with the Greeks I have found to be recent, so to speak, from yesterday or the day before. I mean, the founding of cities and matters concerning invention of arts and recording of laws, and just about the most recent of all of them is care in relation to the writing of histories. For the ancient Greek authors themselves acknowledge that matters to do with the Egyptians or Chaldeans or Phoenicians are extremely ancient, and that they have a stable tradition of memorialization. Josephus notes that these people were not subject to catastrophic climatic events, and so nothing was left unrecorded, as they continually consecrated public records to be composed. On the other hand, he tells us that the Greece was affected by numerous catastrophic events, which wiped out the memory of past events, and so it was later and with difficulty that they learnt the nature of the alphabet. In fact, Josephus says that the Greeks pride themselves on learning their alphabet from the Phoenicians and Cadmus. This tradition, that the alphabet was brought to Greece by Cadmus, the legendary Phoenician founder of Thebes, is found in Herodotus in his histories, as he writes, "These Phoenicians who came with Cadmus and of whom the Gephyreans were a part brought with them to Hellas, among many other kinds of learning, the alphabet, which had been unknown before this, I think, to the Greeks. As time went on, the sound and the form of the letters were changed." But in relation to the Greek alphabet and writing, Josephus tells us that among the Greeks no authentic writing is to be found older than Homer's poem. But even then, he lived after the events of Trojan War, and it was transmitted by memory and only later put into written form. No dates are provided by Josephus, but Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are thought to have been written down in the 8th century BC, and are certainly the oldest surviving works of ancient Greek literature. To add to this, Josephus tells us that those who attempted to write Greek histories lived only a little while before the Persian invasion of Greece in the 5th century BC, and the first to philosophize on the heavens and matters divine, such as Pherecydes of Syros, Pythagoras, and Thales, are acknowledged by universal consent to have been pupils of the Egyptians and Chaldeans for what little they wrote. And so, on this basis, Josephus asks the question, is it not absurd then for the Greeks to puff themselves up as if they alone know about antiquity and accurately transmit a true account of it? In fact, the problem for Josephus is that they contradict each other when they do write about the same events. And he cites a few examples of this, as he writes, "It would be superfluous for me to instruct those who know more than I how much Hellanicus disagreed with Aeschylaus on the genealogies, and how often Aeschylaus corrects Hesiod, or how Ephorus proves Hellanicus to have lied on most matters, and how Timaeus did the same to Ephorus, and Timaeus' successor to him and everyone to Herodotus." Therefore, Josephus believes that this practice of contradicting themselves when writing about the same events is the opposite of history, as he writes, "For is evidence of true history if everyone both says and writes the same things about the same events. They, on the other hand, think that they will seem the most truthful of all if they describe the same things differently." For Josephus, disagreement among historians is invariably a sign of error and falsehood, and agreement a sign of truth and reliability. Is certainly true for historians, ancient and modern. An event endorsed by many sources is more likely to be accurate. But if those sources agreed on every detail and wrote the same things about the same events, it would invariably be viewed today as some sort of collusion, which harmed its historical accuracy. Nonetheless, this view of Josephus provides a rhetorical foundation for the rest of his treatise. For in subverting the reader's confidence in Greek historiography, it encouraged the receptibility to alternative versions of history. So, he will move on to show the superiority of non-Greek and Judean historiography. Therefore, in defending an alternative non-Greek historiography, Josephus begins by commenting on the careful preservation of the records from among both the Egyptians and the Babylonians. For Josephus, this is because of the priesthood, which had been entrusted with taking care over the records. And for Josephus, from among the Judeans, even greater care was taken, for its record keeping was assigned to the chief priests. His line of reasoning is that history is not for anyone to compose of their own accord, because this leads to disagreements and falsehoods. Instead, only the very best who have been consecrated or set apart for this role should write works of history. As he states, "Not only did they, from the outset, place in charge of this matter the best people, and those devoted to the worship of God, but they also took care that the priestly stock should remain unalloyed and pure. For anyone who takes a share in the priesthood must father children by a woman of the same nation. He must pay no attention to wealth or other distinctions, but should examine her pedigree, procuring her genealogy from the archives and supplying multiple witnesses. And this is our practice, not only in Judea itself, but wherever there is a corpse of our people. There also precision is maintained with regard to the marriages of priests." Now, to give some background, in the Hebrew Bible there were 12 tribes in Israel, but one of those tribes, the Levites, was set apart with the responsibility of temple worship, and from among the Levites, God chose Aaron to minister the temple sacrifices and other rituals, and therefore the divinely ordained priesthood was limited to the descendants of Aaron. This priesthood is set apart from ordinary Israelites as they are a holy seed through the observance of numerous rites and prohibitions, including these marriage prohibitions which Josephus alludes to. For example, in Leviticus 21, 14-15, violations of the marriage prohibition are said to profane the priest's seed or offspring. As such, it was important to keep detailed records of the lineage of priests, and Josephus tells us that for the last 2,000 years, the chief priests are listed in the records by name in line of descent from father to son, and to those who break any of the above rules, it is forbidden to approach the altar or share in any other rite. Moreover, for Josephus, these priests are linked to the preservation and interpretation of the sacred texts, and the priest's consecration made them reliable in matters of truth. In other words, there's an assumption that moral worth is transmitted down through the pure generation of priestly descent. Now, besides the office of the priesthood, of those reliably entrusted with the historical records, there is another office for Josephus, which is that of the prophet. The prophet is somewhat different, given that they are not appointed by right of birth as a priesthood, but appointed by God himself as his messenger. For Josephus, what the prophets have recorded and written down is by inspiration from God, and they recorded plainly events in their own time just as they occurred. This association of Judean historiography with prophets is without parallel in Greek or Roman culture, where prophets or sibyls might predict the future under divine inspiration, but they had no role in the genre of historiography. Similarly striking is the idea of those writing history were recipients of divine inspiration. This notion of learning history from God is theologically reasonable, since God can be presumed to know history comprehensively, but utterly strange to the Greek tradition of historiography. Therefore, for Josephus, this divine inspiration is vital, for it means that there are not 1,000 books in conflict with one another. Instead, as he writes, there are only 22 books containing the record of all time, which are rightly trusted. 5 of these are the books of Moses, which contain both the laws and tradition from the birth of humanity up to his death. For this is a period of a little less than 3,000 years. From the death of Moses until Artaxerxes, king of the Persians after Xerxes, the prophets after Moses wrote the history of what took place in their own time in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and instructions for people on life. Now, this is interesting because it provides a clear reference to a biblical canon in the 1st century. He also says that besides the 22 books, there are those books which have recorded from Artaxerxes up to his own time, but he says that these are not to be judged worthy of the same trust as the exact line of succession of the prophets did not continue. The fact that nobody had altered or added to these writings, as well as their full assent by all Judeans from birth, provided their reliability for Josephus. In fact, he notes that the Judeans are willing to die for their sacred scriptures, and he asks, what Greek would suffer this on behalf of his own writings? He will not face the slightest injury even to save the whole body of Greek literature from obliteration. The implied implication for Josephus is that a willingness to die proves reliability. Now, at this point, Josephus shifts somewhat to himself in relation to his own histories of the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 73 AD. This he does, however, almost as a case study for how someone ought to do historiography. First, he notes that some Greek authors have published histories of the war without even visiting the sites or being anywhere near the action. Instead, they have conducted a few things based on misinformation and given it the name of history, which Josephus says are the complete shamelessness of a drunk. On the other hand, Josephus sought to write a truthful account of the war, having been present at all the events, as he writes, "For I was in command of those we call Galileans, for as long as it was possible to resist, and after being captured, living among the Romans as a prisoner, when they had me under guard, Vespasian and Titus compelled me to be continually in attendance of them. Initially bound, then, when I was released, I was sent from Alexandria with Titus to the siege of Jerusalem. During that time, none of the action escaped my knowledge. I watched and carefully recorded what happened in the Roman camp, and I alone understood what was reported by the deserters. Then, when I had leisure in Rome, when all the work was prepared, having made use of some collaborators for the Greek language, I thus constructed my account of the events. So confident was I of its truthfulness that I decided to use my witnesses before everyone else, the commanders-in-chief during the war, Vespasian and Titus. Josephus also tells us that when he had finished his history of the Jewish war, he presented it to those who had witnessed the events, such as King Agrippa II, and they too bore witness to its truthfulness, and that he had not altered or omitted any facts. Josephus therefore states 2 criteria of historiography, followed by himself, for acquiring an accurate knowledge of events, which is either by having followed the events yourself, that is, as an eyewitness, or by gaining knowledge of events from those who did know about them, that is, by speaking to eyewitnesses. In the case of his book, The Jewish War, he had been an eyewitness and had followed the events himself. Then, in the case of his book Jewish Antiquities, his complete history of the Jewish people, he had gained the knowledge of the events from the sacred scriptures, which gave him an accurate account since they were written by eyewitnesses, and they were priests and prophets for that matter. Moreover, Josephus himself is of priestly descent, and is therefore more than qualified to write about the sacred scriptures, as he was steeped in the philosophy contained in those writings. Now this ends Josephus' digression on the problems of Greek historiography and the superiority of non-Greek Judean historiography, as well as his own credentials as a reliable historian to present this history. Next, he will move on to answer the objections of detractors that Judeans are not an ancient people, and he will do so by first providing evidence of the antiquity of the Jews from Egyptian, Phoenician, and Babylonian sources, before returning to the Greek sources as well. And this will be the subject of the next video. Okay, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.